Hello, friends. I'm Olivia Mattis, welcoming you today on behalf of the Sousa Mendes Foundation. And as many of you know, we do these programs week after week on Sundays, highlighting beautiful stories of rescue and resistance. And we're always really delighted to partner with other organizations, and today is one such occasion. Today we're talking about art that was looted by the Nazis and then recovered both in the immediate post-war period and by the Monuments Men Foundation that continues the work of that group of monuments men from the post-war period. So the Monuments Men Foundation is based in Texas, and we have two representatives with us here today whom you met in the film. Robert Edsel, who's a best-selling author and who's the founder of the Monuments Men Foundation, and Anna Bottinelli, who is the president of the foundation and is an expert on all things Italy. We also have Doreen Carvajal, whom you'll meet today, and then you'll meet again next month on two totally different topics. Doreen is a New York Times reporter, best-selling author. She wrote a book called The Forgetting River about tracing her ancestry back to her pre-Inquisition Jewish roots in Spain. So that's quite a breathtaking story and a breathtaking piece of genealogical research. But today she's here as the founder of the Orphan Art Project. And she's also in the film. You met her at the end of the film where it was talking about Geneva and the freeport of Geneva. So she's here today to talk to you about that. Anna Bottinelli will be moderating your questions. So when it comes time later in the program for the Q&A, she will be taking your questions from the chat box. We don't recognize raised hands. We just ask you to please type your questions into the chat box, and I'm sure that Anna will get to as many as she can. Good. Well, without further ado, let me present to you Mr. Robert Edsel. So Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, it's nice to be with you and your audience. This has been a real beshert, if you want to think of it as that, calling of mine, since having the curiosity about wondering who these men and women were that saved all these works of art during World War II and how they went about doing it. So much of history, and in particular World War II history, is focused on the bad guys. And as I learned more and more about the looting that took place during the war, what interested me were the good guys, the men and the women who volunteered to do this remarkable effort, really creating what we now know today as cultural preservation officers. And the story, as I wrote about it and as we covered it in the film that you all saw, really begins in Italy, because Italy was an ally of Nazi Germany. Hitler, in fact, greatly admired Mussolini. It's hard for people to imagine that in 1925, Mussolini was the Time Magazine of the Year recipient for his extraordinary skills getting the trains running on time and other leadership aspects in Italy. And so Hitler was very fond of Mussolini, and Italy was an early ally of Nazi Germany in 1940. And Hitler visited Florence on his first state visit to Italy in 1938 and spent 5 or 6 days in the country traveling around. But the last day, he only had 10 hours he spent in Florence. And 2 of those hours were spent touring museums. All I'm sure know of or have visited yourself, the Pitti Palace, the Uffizi. And he walked through these galleries, a failed artist, but feeling like he was not understood properly, looking at these works of art. And it really set in motion an extraordinary chain of events where he returned to Berlin and began drawing, some by his own hands, of this new cultural complex he intended on building in his hometown of Linz. And at the center of the town would be this new museum, the Führer Museum, or the Gemäldegalerie Gallery Linz. Of course, this ambition to build a great museum that would house many of the great works of art that Hitler believed were great had some inherent problems in it, namely that so many of the works of art were already in private collections and museum collections. But for someone who had the ambitions that he did, this presented nothing more than an inconvenience, and plans were set in motion to get the works of art that they wanted to have. The events in Italy really are very, very different than what took place in Western Europe. We all know some of the horror stories that took place in Eastern Europe with the annexing of Czech Republic, the Anschutz in Austria, the invasion of Poland that formally commenced World War II in September 1939. And Jews were the target of those thefts, the invasions, the stripping of laws, of course, that started in Germany with the Nuremberg laws and so on, the stripping of rights, I should say. In Western Europe, the activities also targeted Jews, although there was a much more determined effort to make appearances of legality to the looting. They were not unwise to how appearances looked. But in Italy, Italy was a partner of Nazi Germany, and therefore it was a very different policy there. Jews weren't deliberately targeted, and certainly not on the scale of what took place in Western Europe and what had happened in Eastern Europe, until the seminal moment in 1943, following the Western Allies' invasion of Italy, which began in Sicily in July 1943 with the landing of American and British troops in the southern portion of Sicily. And then in September 1943, when the Italians changed sides and took up an alliance with the Western Allies, with the United States, Great Britain, and others. There was a split government in Italy. There was a portion that continued to follow Mussolini, who had been detained and then freed by some Nazi commandos. And it was a puppet government that Hitler propped up for appearance's sake, but the main government of Italy was oriented towards the West. They realized that Hitler was going to lose, and they sided with him. So at that point in time, the looting that takes place in Italy is really, up until that moment, opportunistic driven. You have this army that's there. You have different hiding places and barns and sheds that museums and cultural institutions had moved things out of these cities, fearful about the damage that would occur from bombing and the fires that would be started. So the effort was to get everything out of the cities. And of course, as ground forces are retreating, they're going through these areas, coming across these rare books, paintings, drawings, sculpture, and other things that are hidden, oftentimes rifling through them, looting them on occasion. And as the impact of Italy changing sides really grew, there was this bitterness towards Italians on the part of the Germans, feeling that they'd been backstabbed. And it set off wanton destruction just as a form of punishment, where they would find these repositories and burn them for no reason other than spite. The monuments officers, these men and women, museum directors, curators, art historians, middle-aged at the time, early 40s or so, who walked away from careers that were established to become a new kind of soldier, one charged with saving rather than destroying, walked into harm's way with the armies. They had pitiful resources. There were only a few monuments officers at the very beginning. We focus on two, Dean Keller, who was a professor of art at Yale University, a teacher, and Fred Hart, who was one of the great art historians. In fact, any of you that have had a course in Italian Renaissance art probably had Fred Hart's textbook. It's still used today. And these were the two key monuments officers for the Western Allied armies, for the United States armies, I should say, in Italy, that began in Sicily and worked their way all the way up to the northern part of the country. They were in Naples as the city was liberated, on through Rome, which was minimally damaged, miraculously so. They arrived in Siena with great fears that Siena would be damaged, and it was not. Artfully bypassed is a phrase often kicked around. But they began then a series of discoveries that were really horrifying to them, because they had understood that the works of art that had been moved out of the cities had actually since been moved back in. And in fact, they weren't. They were hidden in these villas in the countryside amidst the ground battles and artillery battles that were taking place. And they arrived in Florence then, horrified to find 38 separate villas in the Tuscan hills that were packed with hundreds of the most important paintings, drawings, sculpture by Michelangelo, by Donatello, and others. And some of these villas had been looted. And it set off a completely different aspect of their job. Rather than trying to protect cultural treasures where they were, they then found themselves as art detectives involved in what was the greatest theft in history, trying to find where some 750 of the most important works of art from the Renaissance had been taken. They were taken by German troops loaded on trucks with no protective measures taken, open top trucks, even in the rain, driven north to these couple of boxes you see in Dornsburg, San Leonardo, and Campo Turris. You see where Milan is in the lower left-hand corner of that map. So you get some sense of where this is. This is a strange area of Italy, Alto Adige region, that is really more German even today than it is Italian. German's really the predominant language in this portion of Italy. And these works were hidden in a jail cell, a carriage house, and so on. And not until the closing days of the war did the monuments men succeed in tracing tips and pursuing leads and ultimately finding all these works, save about a dozen or so that had disappeared en route. But we're speaking of paintings like this painting by Botticelli that belongs to the Uffizi. You all may have seen it today, that was being taken off this truck. And you can really get a sense of how dramatic this was. That truck has no covering on it. There's just straw in the back. And they did put these protective wraps on the corners to try and keep them from rubbing off all of the gold leaf on the frames in driving over these bomb cratered roads. So you really get a sense when you visit these museums today of how miraculous the fact that so many of these things did survive. And yet there are still hundreds of thousands of works of art missing today, worth billions of dollars. The monuments men needed about 3 months to figure out how to get all these things back to Florence. This is a truck carrying some of them, entering the Piazza Signoria to thousands of Florentines there cheering and excited about the fact that these works were in fact being returned to the museums there. So it's a high watermark in the history of the preservation of cultural treasures. It marks the first time a conquering army returned these works of art to the countries from which they'd been looted, and is a model which today we continue our work in encouraging the United States Army to reestablish through a modern day monuments men and women force. And our work continues, not only honoring these men and women in their heroic efforts, but also to continue their mission to locate still missing works of art and return them to the rightful owners. And with that brief summary of many years of work, I will introduce to you Anna Botinelli, who is the president of the Monuments Men Foundation, doing outstanding work leading our organization.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Olivia, for allowing us to share with your wonderful audience the important work of the foundation. Hello, everybody, wherever you're dialing in from. Michael, if you want to pull up our slides, we can begin. As Robert founded our Monuments Men Foundation for the Preservation of Art in 2007, and the primary objective was that of preserving the legacy of the monuments men and women. At the time, their important work had almost been forgotten by history. And so one of the main objectives of Robert was that of finding them, recording their stories, honoring them, and preserving their legacy. But by doing so, we also started trying to continue their mission. In fact, at the end of the war, they found and then later returned more than 4 million stolen objects. This is not just in Italy, in the whole European continent, but there are still hundreds of thousands of works of art still missing. And so one of the main objectives of the foundation today is that of finding and returning the works of art that are still missing. And in the previous slide, you saw some photographs of the beautiful return ceremonies that we hold anytime we find something and return it. Today, we have returned more than 30 objects. We have returned them to countries in Europe, such as Italy, Poland, some German museums that suffered just as much. But we have also donated or returned objects here in the United States. These are very proud moments for our organization. We can, it's a tangible way of righting wrongs of World War II. World War II had way too many wrongs. Too many of them cannot be righted. It is certainly an honor to do what we can to reunite long lost objects with people or the heirs that have been looking for them for more than 70 years. So I thought today I would focus on just two examples that many of you will have already heard of watching the film. Some others will soon watch, perhaps after our talk. And I will begin with the collection of the Prince Felix of Bourbon-Parma. And this is an example of how the foundation can provide assistance beyond the actual finding of the objects, doing all of the research involved to determine who they should be returned to, and then ultimately returning them. We can provide the help in different ways. And these two examples are just provide an example for this. Excuse me. So Prince Felix of Bourbon Parma was married into a branch of the Spanish royal family. He had a very extensive collection of works of art that was housed in his family's home in Villa Borbone delle Pianore, in a small town outside the town of Camaiore, which is near the seaside outside of Florence in Tuscany. And Villa delle Pianore was occupied by German troops. A series of different troops occupied the villa and stripped it of its possession, especially the 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division. That's the division that supposedly did the most looting. Interestingly, Prince Felix by then had actually emigrated to the United States, to Canada via the United States, and it was Sousa Mendes that allowed for him and his family to leave Italy. So this is a connection that we discover while working with Olivia, and I think it's wonderful to be able to mention this further tie with the Sousa Mendes organization. So the villa was almost completely stripped of its possession, and the loot was taken to the Dorsberg Castle. This is one of the locations that Robert has just mentioned in this very peculiar area in North Italy, right at the border with what was at the time the Third Reich, but that it was actually still Italy. In 1945, Michael, we can go on to the next slide. The Monuments Men, the Fifth Army reaches that area of Italy, and with that, the Monuments Men assigned to the Fifth Army. One of them is Monuments Men Dean Keller, and many of the works of art taken from the villa in Villa delle Pianore were found, but 40 works of art were missing from the inventories that the family had provided the Monuments Men to allow them to cross-reference what was there and what was not. And the missing objects, the missing paintings have been kept in a list for more than 70 years, a list that the Carabinieri in Italy, the Carabinieri is the military police in Italy, they have a cultural heritage protection unit. They actually, until just a few years ago, were the only military police in any country to have a dedicated unit to the protection of cultural heritage. And they've been working on leads and working off of this list for many years. And it was in 2014, Michael, we can move forward, that they received some tips that 3 of the 40 paintings that were still missing had been located in Milan. But of course, once you have this tips, it's necessary to then go back to the documents of the time. The Monuments Men in so many ways were the first witnesses of these objects and the first investigators of this. And so we need to always go back to the historical documents and see what do they tell us? And that's when the Carabinieri reached out to our foundation, given our outstanding reputation when it comes to research and understanding not just of what the monuments men did, but the context in which their work can be inserted. And we provided assistance in understanding some of the reports, locating others, and ultimately determining that the 3 paintings that the Carabinieri had reached were in fact 3 of the 40 paintings to be returned to the family, to the Borbone Parma family. 2 paintings were found with one family in Milan, another one was found with another family in Milan. Both of these families had no idea of the past that the works of art had, but they were of course happy to hand over the paintings and for them to be returned. We were very grateful to receive a special to be allowed a special visit to the paintings before they were officially returned to the family. And here you see Robert and I with Capitano Provenza of the Commando in Monza outside of Milan, that was the spearhead behind the return. Now, the other work of art that we mentioned in the film is a beautiful painting by Dutch artist Van Huysen. Michael, we can move forward. And for those who have seen the film, you probably remember, I think, a quote of mine where I say, wouldn't it be great to have this painting in front of us? And it's at the time that we filmed the documentary, the painting had not been returned. And then a few years later, the painting now is back on the walls of the Palatine Gallery in the Pitti Palace in Florence. In this instance, the foundation and Robert in primis provided the assistance as far as raising worldwide awareness. We had enough reasons to know that this painting had survived, and we actually knew that it was in the hands of a private person in Germany, but that was unwilling to return it, although the family knew that it had been stolen. They had tried to get some money from the Italian government in order to return the painting. That is, of course, precedent that governments usually don't want to set. And so what we could do, that was the strongest power that we had, was to raise worldwide awareness so that everybody knew that this painting didn't belong to the people that had it. And Robert included the painting in his book, Saving Italy, as a most wanted work of art still missing. And then in the documentary, as you saw in the film, we gave it, again, we put it on the spotlight. And it was thanks to a combination of diplomacy and investigative work, and of course, this heavy work of public awareness, that in 2019, the painting was finally returned to Italy by the Federal Republic of Germany. And we were thanked publicly, the foundation's work was thanked publicly by the head of the Carabinieri during a very wonderful solemn ceremony in the Sala Bianca of the Pitti Palace. Of course, it says these returns are very time consuming and they take a long time, but there is nothing more rewarding than finally see a painting hanging back on the walls where it belongs. And Michael, if you want to go forward, we believe so much in the power of public awareness that we recently launched our newest initiative, a deck of playing cards that profiles 54 of the most important, some of the most important works of art and cultural objects still missing since the end of the war. The US Army has a long-standing history of using decks of playing cards to raise awareness on a specific subject. So we took that history and created the first ever deck of playing cards that raises awareness of these works of art. These are all works of art that we have every reason to believe that survived the war. In other words, we didn't waste any space for works of art that we know burned. And many of them, especially the ones that you see that have a photograph in color, have resurfaced in the recent past. So, and then they are in unknown locations. And this deck of cards have been received with extreme success. We're very grateful. And I'm adding here on the screen, you can see ways to purchase it. It's available on our website. And the more we spread the awareness on this work of art, the more likely they are to be returned to the rightful owners. And because I mentioned that some of these works of art are in unknown locations, but one of them could be freeports, I think it is perfectly fitting for me to hand the floor over to Doreen Carr Howe, who is one of the few journalists that actually had access to freeports. And I think we're all eager to hear what she can tell us about it.
Thank you for inviting me to this event, and hello from France, which is stormy right now. I first got interested in this topic as a culture reporter for the New York Times, and I started reporting on a number of stories where people were trying to crack the code of secrecy and kind of the insular world of the art market. From that, I ended up co-founding with some other former New York Times people an organization called the Orphan Art Project. And our goal is just to offer aid and support and encouragement to descendants who are trying to track down objects that were looted from their families. And one of the things that we find with people is they have to figure out how to penetrate this very insular, secretive world. And a key part right now still exists is the Freeport, which was part of the episode that many of you just saw. The Freeports are based in different countries, but one of the primary ones is in Geneva. And what it is a giant storehouse, warehouse, very protected. Basically they sell secrecy. It's kind of a limbo where people can store art and they can hide who is the real owner. In Geneva, I'll give you an example. Say you're a Russian oligarch and you have some art and you want to just stash it to protect your money. You can stash it in the Freeport and you don't have to list who you are. In other words, you could say the owner is a shell company, Russian oligarch, LLC. But it doesn't list the name of the person who actually owns it. And this is part of the culture of Switzerland, secrecy. The Freeports are majority owned by the Geneva Canton. And there's been pressure to try and change this so that ownership could be determined in the Freeports, but it's been resisted. Here's how it could work. Say you're a Russian oligarch again, and you have a Matisse in the Freeport. Say you want to sell it privately without paying any taxes, that's possible in the Freeports. You sell it to another person and you wire the money between the two of you. No one knows about the sale. There's no taxes involved. It may just move within the Freeport as kind of a chip. And obviously this is quite costly. In the most recent reports, it's estimated that there's about €1 billion worth of art, €1 billion worth of art in the Freeports, largely antiquities, art, but also wine, antique cars, etc. There's been new pressure, obviously with the Ukraine and what's happening there and sanctions. And in Switzerland in March, there's been an effort to sanction some of the Russian oligarchs with particular names, also including their wives. But within the Freeports, because of the system of secrecy, there's no way that they could go after the real owners because they would be shielded by their shell companies. One of the things that I want to mention that also goes back to during the occupation is that secrecy is so embedded in the culture of Switzerland, and which is why I think this continues in the Freeports today. For example, Hermann Göring's top art advisor was someone who pioneered bartering looted art that the Nazis didn't want to trade for art that they did want. And some of that art ended up a lot of the art ended up being bartered and sold in Switzerland, but also stored there in bank vaults. And now this may seem like a long time ago, but as late as, let's see, 2004, a Pissarro painting was discovered in the bank vault of this 95-year-old advisor to Göring, who was living in Switzerland. He had registered the vault to a shell company in Luxembourg. And it was discovered when he died. That was in 2004. So you can see that there's a real need for transparency. It's historically part of the culture of Switzerland. It remains in existence at these freeports, as you saw them. They're huge, they're bomb-proof. You know, one small, tiny storage room starts at 1,200 a month, 1,200 Swiss francs a month, and then goes on up from there. And the people that use the system are paying for it to, in many cases, to launder money. And it will not change until some of the culture changes in Switzerland. So those are my thoughts on the freeports.
So we're about halfway through the program now. Our presenters have really stuck to their 10-minute time slot and not run over. So we have lots of time for discussion, which is really wonderful. Anna's going to be looking in the chat box for your questions. So I would encourage you to continue putting your questions in there. Right now, it's my pleasure to tell you about what's upcoming at the Sousa Mendes Foundation. And that'll give you more time to put in your questions. It'll give Anna more time to gather them. So today, after the program, you will receive an email telling you about upcoming programs. And let me entice you to sign up for them. Next week, May 22nd, we are focusing again on Switzerland. We're focusing on Switzerland today as sort of the bad guy in the story. Next week, we have this beautiful positive story that takes place in Switzerland. But it's a Polish story inside of Switzerland, which was so interesting. There were Polish diplomats stationed in Bern, Switzerland, who came up with an ingenious rescue plan, together with some Polish Jews who were living in Switzerland. And their plan was intended to save the lives of Polish Jews who were trapped in Nazi-occupied Poland. And what was this plan that they developed in Bern, Switzerland? It was to create phony passports to the country of Paraguay. And they started issuing these passports. They issued thousands of passports. This group is now beginning to be recognized by Yad Vashem. It was a group of 6 or 7 people. One of them has already been honored by Yad Vashem. And what's more audacious is that these diplomats then contacted the government of Paraguay to urge them to accept their new citizens. So this is a very audacious story. We have next week Heidi Fishman, whose family was literally pulled off a train to Auschwitz on the strength of one of these Paraguayan passports. We also have Alexandra Reiter, who is the granddaughter of one of these diplomats, that diplomat being called Stefan Renievich. And in addition, we have our resident historian, Mordechai Paldiel, who's on many of our programs, and you will learn his personal rescue story that is intimately connected with this man, Stefan Renievich. So it's a program you will not want to miss. It's a free program. The following year, we have another very unusual, the following week, we have a very unusual program, and it's called Tevye the Black Cantor, the remarkable story of Thomas LaRue Jones. And here we talk about this phenomenon of African-American cantors of the Jewish liturgy that existed in the 1920s and 30s. And in particular, we're focusing on this man, Tevye, Thomas LaRue Jones. And we have the world's expert on these black cantors. His name is Henry Sapoznik, and he's been looking for 45 years for a recording of Thomas LaRue Jones, who was this Caruso type figure who would drive his audiences to ecstasy. And he's finally located the recording, and you will have a chance to hear it. It's quite remarkable. In addition, on that same program, we have Michelle Obama's cousin. That's Rabbi Capers Finney, who will tell us about the history of the Black Hebrew presence in America. So that's another really fascinating subject. The following week, June 5th, we have Dr. Ruth Westheimer, who will be with us in person celebrating her birthday. And there is a film, a wonderful film that you'll have a chance to see, and you'll meet her. There's also a children's book that she has written. It's perfectly G-rated, not to worry. So please order it for your children and grandchildren. It's really terrific. And I hope you will sign up. And the final program I want to tell you about is June 12th, when we will have the pleasure of having Doreen Carvajal once again as our guest in a program called Daughters of the Inquisition, Retracing Long-Lost Jewish Roots. So Anna, I'm now going to turn the program back over to you for the Q&A.
Thank you, Olivia. We have some quite a few questions coming through. A couple of them I can address quickly before I pass the floor on to Robert and Doreen. A question asks, in the movie, 10 small works of art were missing. 2 were recovered, then additional were recovered, but we weren't shown anything about them. Can you reveal anything about those additional 3? So briefly, the 10 that were missing, 2 were recovered in 1963 in Pasadena. These are back in Uffizi. Additional 5 were found in Munich around the same time in 63. That adds up to 7. Now there are 3 missing. The Van Huysum vase of flowers that I talked about is one of the 3. So now there are 2 missing. And those 2 are included in our most wanted deck of cards, because what happened is that a crate was stolen by soldiers of the Wehrmacht from one of the repositories in the Tuscan countryside that Robert mentioned, where work of art had been moved out of the city center. And this crate was either already opened and damaged, and the Germans had an easy access, or they opened it themselves. And they divided among themselves these 10 paintings. And 2 ended up in California with this German soldier that moved there after the war. Others were sent to Munich, and the Van Huysum the soldier sent it to his wife in Germany. So we have every reason to believe that the 2 that are still missing are with fellow soldiers in that same military unit, but the Carabinieri have open leads on them. And so they are restricted files that we cannot really go into. So I hope that answers the question. Now I have a couple of questions that I can combine and ask Robert that he can quickly address. Are any of the missing works of art in museums? And then somebody else asks, when these missing works of art are located, how do people with this art justify holding it? Robert.
There are missing works of art everywhere. Some of the works of art that are missing from the war are in museums. We're dealing with a work of art that is in the Houston Museum of Fine Arts that we're having issues with. So they're everywhere. They're in private collections. They're in just every country, because soldiers and people who were displaced persons immigrated all over the world. But I think we can summarize quickly and say, if it was a work of art that was hidden in the eastern portion of Europe that Soviet Red Army troops were in, it's likely somewhere in the former Soviet republics. If it was somewhere in the West, figure out which armies were there, American, British, French, and so on. And there's a good chance it's with someone who was in those armies in their respective country. Where that argument fails a bit is the cross-pollination that took place in Berlin and other places where soldiers exchanged and swapped paintings for hose or paintings for cameras and all of that. But so many of these works of art came to the United States in 1950s after people stopped looking. And no one cared about provenance, which is a fancy word for who owned it previously, until the advent of the internet. So the second question, how does someone who has it justify keeping it? there are two answers to that, two simple answers. One is, in the United States, generally speaking, our laws say no passage of time can change the character of a theft. So if it's stolen, it's always stolen, and you can't ever make it unstolen. However, in Europe, differing laws in differing countries have statute of limitations, and it creates a bifurcated possession of works of art where it's possible that you could have ownership of something but not have good title to it. In other words, it's clear that it was stolen during the war, but you acquired it more than 30 or 35 years after the war, and so you have possession of it. You would not be able to sell a painting like that in the United States or in Great Britain because it would be stopped for being stolen, but you would be able to sell it in some countries in Europe, although it's becoming increasingly difficult, partly due to the visibility the foundations bring into these matters and making it difficult. As to, I think, what your underlying question on that point is, how can someone feel good about owning a work of art that has blood dripping off of it? You know, there's people in the world that look at these things simply as an asset. There's some collectors that look at works of art like their children. And to quote that line of Charlton Heston's about gun control, sooner they'd have an easier success than trying to pry it out of somebody's hand. And that's the attitude of some collectors. Lawyers get in the way, technical defenses get in the way, and it's exceedingly expensive to pursue recovery of these works of art. And that's something the foundation's trying to bring increased visibility to, hopefully to change that.
Well, thank you. And Doreen, I don't know if you had a chance to see, a couple of people have read your book and said that they loved it. So I wanted to make sure.
No, I didn't see that. Thank you.
Well, I wanted to make sure you knew that. And someone asked, although I think you probably answered it, but I want to ask the question again in case you have anything else to add. How are freeports, how can they exist? How are they allowed to exist? And then another question on cryptocurrency that I'm going to ask it in case you have contribution. If not, maybe Robert can say, but the question is, will the availability of cryptocurrency make it any more difficult to trace stolen art? Any ideas how to get around it? Doreen.
Okay, I'm going to cede the cryptocurrency to Robert, but I'll address how the freeports have evolved. I mean, they're spreading in Singapore, in Delaware, in Luxembourg. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a government institution, the Geneva Canton, that is the majority owner of the freeport. So it's a source of revenue for the government, and they continue to resist transparency for ownership. They tinker around the edges, but they do not have the resources for customs in Switzerland, for example, to check all the things that are coming into the free ports. And I think Robert asked me that in the episode. Will that change? Will they become more transparent? And my view is no, because that's part of what they're selling is the secrecy. But there continues to be pressure on them to change. But as long as they're profitable and a high source of revenue, the free ports are spreading. Although in Luxembourg, for instance, there are more regulations there where you have to reveal who the real owner is. You can't just be a shell company that's listed as the owner. So there's some changes that are taking in different places. But for now, until Geneva changed its system, it will remain that way. I mean, it started as a system to allow agricultural products to be imported into Switzerland without paying taxes before they were moved on again. And it evolved from that system, from agricultural products into art, as people realized that they could use it as a tax dodge system. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, and Robert, a few words on the cryptocurrency before I want to for sure get another question in. That's a very interesting one. if you have anything.
Well, cryptocurrency, I would quickly say, if anybody, look, I think can all agree privacy is something we should all be entitled to, and most of us would like. There's a difference in privacy and secrecy that really hinges on what's intent. Anyone that's paying taxes, if there's anyone on this call that's not paying taxes, raise your hand. I'm just joking. The point is, we're all paying taxes. And none of us are going to like the fact that we're going to get taxed more, because there's a lot of people in the world using cryptocurrency to not pay taxes. And that is not going to be sustainable. If you think that it's fine that people buy, sell, and trade works of art worth tens of millions of dollars, and that no taxing authorities know about that, and the tax isn't being paid on that, and it allows, as Doreen outlined, the ability for people who are doing bad things, not everybody is, but some are, and perhaps trafficking in stolen works of art or works of art that people have in violation of cultural property laws, then cryptocurrencies for you, baby. But we just haven't, as has happened with technology over and over again, we put these tools out there like social media, or anti-social media, as I refer to it, and people use it, but we don't talk about in advance what other kinds of unintended consequences might be associated with that. And so cryptocurrency is out there being used, but we haven't contemplated what are some of the problems cryptocurrency can create. Now, the people that do talk about it are at the FBI and other policing authorities that are trying to figure out how to counteract the use of some people using cryptocurrency in the dark world. So that's a quick answer to it. It is a serious problem, and it's going to make a challenging situation worse.
Thank you. For the sake of time, I'm combining two questions in one. Again, Robert might be the best to give a synthetic answer. One question is, as a conservator in private practice, it would be wonderful to know other resources for us for suspected looted artworks to be identified outside the FBI and Interpol databases. This comes up with our community very often, and we do discover things which we learn were taken out of Europe during or post-war, which we suspect. Any resources you can share with our community would be helpful. And somebody else had actually asked if the foundation and the FBI collaborate. So I think Robert can answer this one, but then there is a couple of people asking about the work of art that you mentioned is in the Houston Museum, and what can people do perhaps to put pressure on the museum?
The foundation has an outstanding relationship with the FBI art looting team, that's managed by a great guy from Louisiana right now who's in Washington. There's also an office that they have in Dallas and other major cities. They deal primarily with counterfeits, but they certainly do deal with looted works of art and so on. In fact, I was up there meeting with them in Washington just a few weeks ago. We have occasions where people that contact the foundation do so anonymously, and they would like our help, and we respect those anonymities. We really don't care. We're always interested in knowing how somebody got something, but we're a not-for-profit organization. We depend on the help of the public to sustain our activities. That means people that want to donate their time. It means people that want to donate some money to what we do if you believe what we do is important. The foundation has found and returned more than 30 stolen objects, priceless objects, to, as Anna said, museums, archives, religious objects that we donated to the Dallas Holocaust Museum here a few years ago, and so on. We are agnostic. We don't care which way it goes, whether it heads east or heads west. We just want to make sure it goes to the rightful owner. We bring visibility to these things. We do the research on them. So as to this conservatives question, in my opinion, as objective as I can be, the best organization to go to anytime you or your colleagues come across a work of art that you think has a questionable provenance to it, or very likely could have been stolen or removed from a country in violation of cultural property laws, is to send an email and or photograph, in particular of the back, because you understand why that's so important, to the foundation. If you want us to review it anonymously, we will hold that in confidence, and the FBI knows that we do that, and that sometimes we can't tell them unless they lay a subpoena on us, which they're not going to do because we're cooperative with them. and we don't charge anybody for our services. We will look at it and get back to you. And we triage these things. We get more calls than we can adequately research, but we are always focused on those that are the most prospective. And it's a great aspect of what we do. So yes, we work with the FBI when we have a case that crosses from our arena to law enforcement. We involve them. As to how people can help, the case in Houston is a very, very simple case in many respects. The museum is using technical defenses to argue that they are entitled to keep a picture that the monuments men in 1946 returned in error to the Netherlands, and then the Netherlands they recognized their mistake and notified the Netherlands. The Netherlands went ahead and gave it to a guy who was claiming a picture, same picture, same subject by the same artist. And when he realized the picture he got was not his, he fraudulently created a different background on it and then sold it. And the person that bought it eventually donated to the museum in Houston. They are unmoved about the fact that they have a picture under these circumstances. They claim the underlying Jew that owned it sold it to the buyer of Adolf Hitler voluntarily. My view is I can't construct a scenario where you could argue that a Jew selling a work of art to Adolf Hitler or Adolf Hitler's representatives can ever be an arm's length transaction. And we have evidence that this particular transaction was not. So it's a very, very frustrating case. Yes, you could certainly write the museum, et cetera. It's in litigation. We are advising the family that's pursuing this because it was, in our view, such an egregious example by one of our leading museums in this country, and something we hope we can, a right that we hope we can influence and get this picture back to the family.
Thank you. I think we have just maybe a minute, Olivia. What do you think? Just
Yeah,
2 minutes?
sure. And I would love to get your answer to the question of what motivates you to do this important work.
Yes, thank you. Well, I'll let Robert answer for himself. As far as I'm concerned, I am an art historian. I was born in Florence. I've been breathing art since I was born. I've been growing up going to the Uffizi, and yet I had never heard of the Monuments Men, and that the art that I had been looking at since I was a little girl had been stolen or had been very close to being destroyed. And so when I first met Robert more than 10 years ago, and he introduced me to this subject, I thought how wonderful in the world of art history. It is very difficult to come up with anything new. I feel scholars just dig into archives hoping they can uncover something that nobody else has uncovered yet, and it's getting increasingly difficult. And yet there was this fascinating story that wasn't known. And so I started working with Robert on his book, Saving Italy, and then evolved into being more involved with the foundation. And for me, it's a way of bringing awareness to an incredible story that is exciting and can appeal not just to our historians, but to everybody, and raise this. I think we all care for cultural heritage. We might just not know that we do. And so I feel what I'm contributing is making sure that we reach back in our mind and realize that we really care for this subject, whether it's something that's stolen that needs to be returned, whether it's the Notre Dame Cathedral that needs to be preserved and not let another fire happen. Regardless of what it is, it touches upon something that I think we all care deeply and might just not be aware of it. Robert.
I would say this, in the earliest years of me speaking about the monuments men and women, the most popular and first question I was asked in presentations was, we didn't know you were a Jew. And I used to say, well, I'm not. Why do you ask? Well, why do you care so much about this? And I said, well, this is a much bigger subject than just being a Jew. It's a hugely important subject, and we don't need to look any further than seeing what the news headlines are out of Ukraine today. There is an ongoing effort to destroy a country's culture, its heritage, its language. And we've seen this play out. We know how this works. And every time there is a Holocaust, lowercase h, of destroying people, it doesn't usually begin with the murdering of people. It begins with the destruction of the things they believe in, the things they value, what defines their society. Of course, Jews suffered so gravely during World War II. And the opportunity for us to right some wrongs where we can do it, I think it's a calling, it's a privilege. Something General Eisenhower said, referring to the return of these works of art to the rightful owners. He didn't say it was our duty. He didn't say it was an obligation. He used the word privilege. And he didn't do that by accident. He said it was a privilege to return these things. And that's certainly how we look at it. So the stakes are high. We are already reliving events 77 years after a period of time that we thought we wouldn't have to go through this again. And here we are, once again, watching it happen, unfolding in very similar ways. And I just think what we do is a critical component to bring visibility, not just to the importance of preserving cultural treasures, but also reminding people why this was important during World War II, why it's important today. Let me close with this comment. General Eisenhower said, in a democracy at least, there always stands beyond the materialism and destructiveness of war those ideals for which it was fought. Ideals don't have a time expiry. They're principles, they last forever. And if we decide that we're going to stop caring about these things, it's game over for democracy as far as I'm concerned. So nothing less than that's hanging in the balance. And it's why we work so diligently to do what we do.
Wow. So Doreen, what final thoughts would you like to share with our audience today?
Well, just riffing on something Robert just said, looting is a systematic form of erasing identity. And I got interested in this because previously I was researching our own family's secret identity of being Jews, which they guarded for decades, but they kept it secret because of what happened during the Inquisition. And so I guess one of my key messages and what I do when I try to help descendants is to emphasize that storytelling, telling the story of what happened, of a looted object, something in the family, is a form of restitution. It's a way of reclaiming memory. Nothing has more impact than the story. And so I think it's important for some of you who are watching this here, you probably have stories in your own family. Maybe there's an object that's particularly, or an heirloom that's important to you. Tell that story, pass on that story, keep the legacy alive. So that people will learn from what happened, and they will prevent this from happening again, like in the Ukraine, where the looting is going on now. So I think each and every one of us can tell our stories and make restitution.
Anna, what would you like to say in closing?
Well, first of all, thank you, Doreen, for this message. That is such an important message and one that's not being said enough. So thank you for leaving us with this note. And Robert has already said it, but I'll say it again. The foundation does important work. And we are a very small team doing a lot, and we can do a lot more if with the support of the public. So if anybody was touched by what we shared today and wants to learn more, we are available. We pride ourselves of answering every inquiry that we get every day, and we get a lot. So be sure that if you reach out, you will be answered, and we would love to begin a dialogue and help righting more wrongs.
And I want to add on a personal note that I ordered your deck of cards. They are just wonderful. And that deck of cards is now part of the archive and library of the Susan Mendes Foundation. But
Thank you.
furthermore, it has inspired us. We are now looking into creating a deck of cards of rescuers and heroes of the resistance to help us tell our story. So thank you for inspiring us in the work that we do. And I want to thank our wonderful speakers, Robert Edsel and Anna Bottinelli from the Monuments Foundation, author Doreen Carvajal, whom we will see again on June 12th. I'm so excited about that. And of course, thank you to our wonderful audience that comes week after week. So have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone. See you soon. Bye-bye.